Okay, welcome to December 2019 Green Infrastructure, Climate and Cities. This is for those of you joining us for the first time, this is a monthly seminar series that we have been doing since 2014 with a variety of partners. I'd like to highlight our newest collaboration with the Philadelphia section of the American Society of Civil Engineers and welcome those of you who came through that venue. In general, the series addresses the issues of climate change in cities, and green infrastructure is meant sort of generally as just different ways of approaching the challenges that climate is focusing or is creating for our cities. And so typically we have between 1 and 3 speakers per month. It's always the first Wednesday of the month if you're new to our group. Some of these speakers are here in person. Sometimes we have speakers who attend remotely. Today we have 2 speakers attending remotely. This gives us the ability to bring in speakers from across the country, and we've even had people internationally. All of our seminars are webcast and broadcast in real time, so in addition to those of you who are here in the room, there's other people attending via our YouTube channel. And those of you attending online, we're happy to relay the questions that you might have for our speakers. If you put them in the chat box, we will pass those on. Again, to those of you joining us for the first time, if you're interested in any of our previous seminars, you can go to the CCRUN, Consortium for Climate Risks in the Northeast website, and we've got archived webinars for everything that we've done in the past. So we'd love to have you download those. To the PEs in the room, we are offering continuing education credits. We have certificates here for those of you who are in person. Those of you attending online who would like PH credits, as long as you're registered and you email us, we'll send you back a certificate for your records. So today's topic is energy technology in buildings, and we have 2 speakers both presenting remotely. So we have Dr. Chanjen Hong and Dr. Janet Reyna. So I'll just give some basic information on the 2 speakers. So Dr. Hong's talk is titled Pathways to 100% Clean Energy for Buildings in Cities. And he will introduce urban systems research at the Building Technology and Urban Systems Division, focusing on modeling and simulation of urban buildings to explore pathways to 100% clean energy. So Dr. Hong is a staff scientist and deputy head of the Building Technologies Department of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Then following up, we'll have Dr. Janet Reyna, who's a research engineer at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the Buildings and Thermal Systems Center. So Dr. Reyna's talk is titled The Role of Building Energy Demand in Our Low Carbon Future, Modeling Opportunities with NREL's RESTOC and COMSTOC tools. So in her talk, Dr. Reyna will discuss ongoing efforts at NREL to model the residential and commercial building sectors with increased disaggregation by time, location, building type, and technology type. So the format for today's seminar will have each of the speakers are going to talk for about 40 minutes. I'll transfer the screen control over to them. They'll talk. After Dr. Hong's talk, we'll open it up for questions, and after about 15 minutes, we'll go on to Dr. Reyna's talk and have questions at the end as well. Before I hand it over to Dr. Hong, I just wanted to entice you with next month, beginning of January, we're going to be talking about compound flooding and focusing on a local issue, flooding in Southeast Philadelphia and in the Eastwood neighborhood of Philadelphia. So that's our focus for next week. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Hong. I realized I forgot to unmute myself, so he didn't hear anything of what I just said. So, apologies. Does that mean that the YouTube folks didn't hear that either, or did they hear it?
YouTube heard it.
YouTube heard it, okay. Okay, Dr. Hong, I apologize. I forgot to unmute myself when I did the introduction. So I just finished your introduction and you're up. So if you will share your screen.
Yes, let me do it. Okay.
Okay, so you're all set. I'll hand it over to you. We're not seeing your first slide though. There you go. Okay, it's all you.
Okay.
Okay, good. Thank you for this opportunity. So I'm Tianzhen Hong from Berkeley Lab, and I'm happy today to share with you some of the research we have been working on for the last, a couple of years, focusing on how we get buildings in cities, to be, zero net energy. And I'm sure there'll be some, questions and synergies, between our research and the work. And I think later, Janet from UNRWA is going to presenting, their work also. So these are funded mostly by Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. So if we look at the history, I think looking at the evolution of the built environment. So you see some pictures here. If we start looking at the igloo, basically it's not electricity or natural gas, right? You still get energy from the sun, but it's really a zero net energy. It's not a building per se, but it's like a shelter, right? And then go down, you see, I'm not sure whether you see my mouse cursor, but it's a donut-shaped building. It's an ancient building in China. So I think it's also, using very less energy, using a lot of passive design, thermal mass. But if we move ahead and to the middle, the modern buildings, right? These have the, vegetarian green roof, very open space, try to use daylight and natural ventilation. So, these are the high performance buildings, I think get to the least, platinum or the gold, ratings. And more complicated buildings, for example, like this super tall building in Dubai, the X-shaped buildings in London, very interesting, right? The facade, you see that's a very curved shape, but also the vertical, vegetation. And also some of the facilities, like this one is called Water Cube in Beijing. It's one of the Olympic facilities. So as you can see, buildings, all the shelters evolve from very simple to very complicated, providing, very sophisticated services for humans. And we are basically now asking the same question: can we design, operate these buildings in a net zero energy way, right? So that's a big question, and I think there's a lot of examples. New buildings have been constructed and operated, actually achieving the zero net energy goal. And so this is a database compiled by New Building Institute, and basically you can see, right, it's got data from 2012 all the way to 2019. Of course, the 2019 data is not completed yet, but you can see there's almost 500 buildings, right, that achieve, or some maybe it's a couple buildings together as a campus or district that achieve this zero net energy, performance goal. So basically, this telling us is that, well, it's a possibility. It's for different building type across, all the U.S., locations, different climates. And most of these are commercial buildings. So I think when we move to the residential buildings, right, Navigant also has been compiling a database of these new homes, either single family or multi-family, built across different climates in the country. And these are all zero net energy homes, right? So I think commercial, residential, we all have the examples, which basically telling us, right, technologies are already here today, and, we have those buildings. But I guess the real challenge, well, how can we scale them up? So take a step back, looking at a definition of zero net energy buildings. And I think interesting things here, some are in common and some are differences. I think what's in common is among the different definitions of G&E buildings, they're all calculating the energy on an annual basis. So basically, we are saying a building is G&E means the energy consumed, right, on an annual basis equals the energy produced on site, also on an annual basis, right? So that is all the common definitions. But then when you go to the actual metrics, I think the ASHRAE is using the site energy, which basically count one equal unit of energy from all resources are equal, right? And U.S. Department of Energy is using source energy, which basically value electricity, it's about 3 times the natural gas in terms of equal unit of energy. In California, we are using time-dependent valuation energy. So basically, it values, every hour of energy differently. Depends on its commercial, residential, and is it electricity, natural gas, and also vary by climate zone. So it's a more complicated metric. Try to consider, some of the life cycle, influence of energy. But what these three metrics don't consider is the life cycle embodied energy, if you will, right? Like when we use all different material to build a building, and those cost energy, right? To extract the raw material, to process, manufacture, and also for transportation to the construction site. So most of the metric we're talking today, at least used in the U.S., don't consider those embodied energy. I think the Europeans, especially the country like Sweden and Switzerland, and they are, and Norway, they are, more aggressive in pursuing the life cycle energy perspective of Z&E definition. The other dimension is, when you talk about Z&E, is it just include one building or include a group of buildings? And I think there's a differentiation here, because when you're talking about group of building, for example, like your campus, right, in Drexel, right, you may have a district energy system. So that will bring a different technology and different opportunities in terms of, achieving the Z&E goal. So when we look at the big puzzle here, right, we try to get to Z&E buildings. So we're looking at what are the key pieces that would drive, this actual goal. So I think I listed a few things here on the very top. Of course, right, we talk technologies a lot, and technology about insulation, windows, about HVAC systems, controls, daylighting, as you can count. And of course, very important is the operation and maintenance. I think we've seen so many examples that, same building, almost similar building, but operated differently, maintained differently. I think their actual energy performance will be very different, right? And it's on the left side, it's also policy, right? Any incentive programs by federal government, by utility, and we also tightening up the appliance, standards. I think when we get into Z&E, basically the envelope, loads, lighting, HVAC can consume less, but I think we're getting more widgets and more stuff in the home or in our buildings. So I think tightening up the efficiency standard for those equipment and appliances are getting much more important. And on the bottom, of course, very important is the building code, all the labeling programs that, like the U.S. LEED, certificates. And as important is how occupants in the building perform, right? People have different preference of temperature, the way they interact with all those component and system of devices, like open, close windows, dim the lights. When they leave the office for the day, do they close the lights, turn off the lights? So those are also important factors of, actual building performance. So on the code side, I think this is a slide I borrowed from the ASHRAE's 90.1 code team. As you can see, right, the code started at about early 1980, and in every code cycle, about 3 years, they're, tightening the requirements of the efficiency. So you can see these are energy use index, right? Drop, every code cycle, and I think the idea is try to get to, zero net energy, by 2030. And so, as you can see, I think there's still progress, to be made. On the residential side, I think the IECC is doing something similar. They're also tightening up the residential code, to ensure that, the code will get to Z&E goal, by 2030. So a few years ago, we took a look at these are the actual high-performance buildings, from a couple data sources. And at the bottom table, basically, we look at about 21 buildings in the U.S., 11 buildings in Europe, and 12 buildings in Asia, about 7 buildings in China. So these are like a high-performance building because they are either rated by LEED or some, China's own LEED system, or the Europeans, or, basically, they have their own system. But these are the buildings. And we put these 51 buildings all together in this chart. I think the vertical, that is the site energy use intensity, and each bar represents one building. So a few interesting things you can observe. I think the first horizontal line represents all the average commercial building site EUI, about 91 kBtu per square foot. This is from CBase, right? Database. But for office building, it's about 76.3, right? And the 90.1 basically is saying about 34.8. So we can see from these 51 buildings, basically more than 50% are actually consuming more energy than the 90.1 2010 code. So I think there's a performance gap, if we will, between the, when the building is designed and their actual, performance. So I think it's interesting later on we can talk about, where are those driving factors of the gap and, how can we do about it. So when we look at the technology used in these 51 buildings, I think I summarized this in this chart, and not surprising, right? I think in terms of lighting, there's a lot of use of daylighting, right? And dimming occupancy controls, right? And then use of high efficient lighting system like LED, right? On the envelope, I think there's a better insulation, glazing, and also use of solar shading, to control the solar heat gain. And for the HVAC, there's also use of natural ventilation for certain climate, right? Use of night purge and, to sort of cool the building. And system type like, underfloor air distribution, ground source heat pump, also a chill beam. I think these are sort of the low energy, cooling systems are quite, popular in these kind of, high performance buildings. But of course, the high efficiency HVAC equipment is also used, like, the high rooftop units or the, high COP chillers. On the renewable energy side, I think a lot of the buildings are using the solar, photovoltaic, right? And some are also using the solar thermal, and some, with limited examples are using some on-site, wind turbine. So these are, nothing new, I think, in terms of the technology too, right? So take a look at some of the roadmap developed by Department of Energy, and this one is basically the lighting. If we look at for the last 100 years, right, we started with the incandescent light, and now we, like LED, now it's, the cost is down significantly, and it's, lighting efficacy is up to like 130, lumen per watt. So this is now becomes the daily technology, if you will, for the lighting, new lighting systems, right? So the other example is to look at the windows, and I think these are looking at the last almost 50 years, right? We started with single pane window, right? The U value is almost 1, and then we go to double pane, and then we have the low E, and now we're talking about this high insulation window. So the target is to get to R10, right? That will be comparable to some of the insulated, opaque materials. So that is the technology is heading. And I think this green line is interesting. So traditionally, we see window as a burden from an energy point of view. But if we can get to this R10 and have some dynamic control, windows themselves can actually be energy positive. So I think that's a pivotal point there. On the HVAC side, and this is just an example from Mr. Lee, the energy efficient engineer in Singapore. And so I think the illustrates very interesting, the comparison between a conventional design and state-of-the-art design of a central chiller plant. So the chiller efficiency, conventional design may be 0.75 kW per time. But I think today you can actually buy a chiller with better than 0.5 kW per time, right? So that is the technology. And then the air handling unit, I think this is more like the design of the low pressure loss, air duct, and fan system. So, you can basically drop from 0.6 all the way to 1/10, the 0.06. Same thing for the chill water pump, condenser water pump, and the cooling tower. The very bottom is sums the total kilowatt per time. Conventional design is about 1.75, and we can do for the state-of-the-art design to 0.6. So that is almost like 1/3 of the conventional design, and this has already been implemented in many projects and real buildings. So it's just some dedicated engineering, I think, that enables us to, have much energy efficient HVAC, system. In this case, it's the central chiller plant. So the other perspective is quite often in our building design, I think that, these are different disciplines, right? Lighting, architecture, HVAC, and daylighting, that seems to be done by different teams with very limited communication. And so I think these interactions between these disciplines, are very important. So I think that these new ways of thinking in a design process is to use this integrated, design. Basically, everybody in the same project, together, and then considering interaction between all these different disciplines. For example, if we have very high efficient lighting system, obviously heat gain from the lighting will be much less, and that has implications on how you site HVAC systems, how you select what type of HVAC systems. So it's this kind of interaction I think needs to be considered in order to optimize the entire, building performance. So most of you may already saw this diagram from New Building Institute. Basically, this just shows each thought is one building, and it compares the design, energy use intensity with the actual major energy use intensity. So the dots are everywhere, but you can see, for most of the dots, they are sort of on average, it's not too bad. But it's a, right triangle highlighted here, and these basically are the low energy buildings we are pursuing. Unfortunately, for these buildings, those that actual energy consumption are higher than the design, which, I think pose a real challenge for us. How can we design these low energy buildings so that we can achieve the actual performance, right? So if you look at how these different factors influence the way we do energy modeling, right? I think I just listed a couple things here. The occupancy, it's important, how the building operated and maintained. Earlier I mentioned occupants' behavior, the actual building controls, and the actual equipment performance, right? Equipment tends to have some sort of, problems here and there, so that needs to be corrected, needs to be maintained, right? And the weather data, what kind of weather data you use to do the simulation, right? So are you using the year that you measure energy use? Sometimes that can be, an important impact as well. And the last two things, yes, the way you make assumptions and simplifications to create energy model, right? And also the tools you use to do the simulation, depends on how complicated your technology or your design. You may also, the tool itself may have some approximation, sometimes there may be a bug, somewhere. So, all these factors contribute to these performance gap, if you will. So I think some are easily we can find out and control. Some are, a little bit more challenging. So to tackle some of these issues that I'm talking about from the International Energy Agency's point of view, there has been a few projects, try to take a deep dive into some of those issues. And the first one is this Annex 53. So basically, you look at the actual energy performance, categorizing its influencing factors into 6. It's a climate, there's a building envelope, there's a building equipment, there's operation, maintenance, occupant behavior, and then there's also indoor environmental conditions. Like, buildings are operating with very different settings of indoor heating and cooling temperatures, right? And outdoor air ventilation rates. So those also have significant influence. So a more recent completed project is Annex 66. So this is particularly focusing on looking at the occupant behavior in buildings. Try to get data, tools, and develop some case studies and best practices, to capture the occupant behavior and integrate them in the way we simulate buildings' performance and try to improve, the way we evaluate technologies, considering how different people would interact with technology in different ways. So there's another IEA project. So I want to have a couple slides just to illustrate the simulation's role, in supporting the design of Z&E buildings. And I think, so simulation can be used, right, in different phases of the building's life cycle, right? I think in the early design, it tries to inform you some of the early design decisions, including the site, the geometry factors, and, and those kind of stuff. And then going down to evaluate some of the system trade-off, like different aspects, system type, determine what kind of renewable energy, determine, what kind of grazing system, right? For example, in San Francisco microclimate, is double grazing always better than single grazing? Those kind of design decisions, can be evaluated early, using energy modeling tools. So as we are part of the National Lab of Department of Energy, so we have been working on this tool called Energy Plus, and this is a national effort. So Andrea is also part of the team. Is developing Energy Plus, and it's a tool used to categorize all the heat and airflow in buildings and try to simulate the energy performance, which is used to develop and for code compliance, right, of new buildings, as well as evaluating technologies for retrofitting buildings to reduce energy use. So it's a tool that has been there for the last 20 years. So this is a slide to wrap up the buildings, and I think now we are looking at these called GIG, it's Grid Interactive Efficient Building. And so I borrowed this figure from ACCC's white paper. So as you can see, it's a traditional building technology, but we also have the on-site generation, also have the energy storage, right, and also ensure the building be able to responsive, right, to the grid. The grid may ask the building to cut a demand, or also sometimes can you use more energy? So it's beyond, just the total amount. It's about when the energy is consumed, that kind of flexibility. Can you consume more during certain time of the day and consume less during the other time of the day? So that demand flexibility now is getting very important. So those are some of our new research projects are focusing on. On the right side, I think this is just Arab's imagination about like buildings in the future. I think it's more about a combination of different type of technology that integrated with productions of food, also transportation, integrated in a 3D dimension. And so I think it's a very interesting thinking. So let me scale this up a little bit. So we're talking about one building, right? But if we look at a city, right? So for example, the New York City have about 1 million buildings, so how can we do, those kind of energy retrofit or new design, right? So there's a city energy profile project, basically look at the energy consumption in cities. And as you can see, buildings basically consume a significant portion of the total city's energy, from 30% all the way to 70%. Right, and so I think one of the key areas when city talking about getting to 100% clean energy is try to, look at efficiency programs for the buildings, sector, right? So there's a Seattle Club, more and more cities are signing up for this 100% clean energy by, 2035 or 2040, right? Okay, so when we model buildings in urban context, it's no longer just a very simple linear, so I model 2 buildings instead of 1. I think one of the important science we are working on is to look at the interaction between buildings. If you're looking in a very dense area in a city, right, so these are buildings that have on the both sides of a narrow street. They have very strong interconnection in terms of solar shading, in terms of the long-wave radiation between those exterior surfaces. So we are considering this kind of interaction. We are also considering while the building is connected to your local climate, right? Most of the time we're using simulation, it's the weather file in the airport, which can be far away, but your local climate, can be very different. So that, sometimes we talk about it's an urban heat island. So we need to consider this. And then the other perspective, buildings also influence the microclimate, right? Buildings release heat, right, through the different channels as illustrated in this figure here, right? There's through the building surfaces as a convection, right? Through the cooling towers, if you have one on the roof, through the rooftop unit, the exhaust air, and then of course, then there's also the exhaust air from the space, like kitchens, cooking, and some of the ventilation needs. So building release heat to the environment, which would influence the environment's temperature, humidity, right? So that, right, further, vice versa would influence the energy demand, in buildings. So it's this kind of interconnection we try to quantify in a, urban environment. So we did some simple simulation, try to look at, well, how strong is this kind of impact? And this is just a simple case study. Basically, it shows that, there's a yellow highlighted building here. So we consider the influence by the surrounding buildings through those different ways of interconnection, right? So if we don't consider those interconnection, right, I think we are underestimating the surface temperature, by from 1 degree to 3, degrees Celsius. And that has significant impact on how much heat actually get released from the surface. We can underestimate by, 20%. So that is significant. So I think basically the message is in a dense urban environment, this kind of interconnection between buildings needs to be considered. So this is just a slide shows how we calculate heat emission from buildings, and we added this as a new feature to Energy Plus. So now when you run Energy Plus, the version 9.2, we have a summary report that reports all these heat emissions, from buildings. And of course, depends on the different type of building. I think they have a very different seasonal profile. So I just want to highlight a couple points in this particular slide. So for a small office building, this is a single-story office building, right? The annual heat emission is 2,300 megajoule per square meter, and the site energy consumption is 621. So basically, that is a factor of 3.7, which means for 1 unit of energy we consume in building, we emit 3.7 units of heat to our environment. So it's a very significant factor. It's not one-to-one, right? If you look at a large office, right, this is like a 10-story building. So basically, it's a much larger percent is the core area, but the ratio is still 1.7, right? So I think down below just have some details, the heat release by different channels. The large office, a log is through the HVAC. Basically, it's a cooling tower, right, that emits most of the heat, from the buildings. But for a small office building, basically it's envelope, the convection through the envelope surfaces is the dominant channel for the heat emission. So we have been working on a tool called CDBES, and this is basically trying to putting all the data together that enable us to model every building in the city. So I think this approach is a little bit different than later Janet will talk about how the Comstock and Restore model buildings in city. They just work for different use cases. So I'm going to give you a couple slides on this. So I think first step is to create the building stock data for cities. And so I illustrate in this workflow, we try to get all the public domain data from cities. There's a building footprint. I think the good thing is that Microsoft just released a public data set of building footprint for every building in the United States. So we're talking about almost 120 million buildings of footprint data, right? And then the detailed land use data about a building type, vintage, number of story, all the things, can be obtained from other data from the city. There's also assessors records sometimes have the data, and sometimes cities also have the energy disclosure program that have the actual energy consumption data for some of those buildings, public buildings or more larger size, commercial buildings. So we basically massage the data, create a database, and standardize it using the DOE's V's. It's more like a data dictionary, right? Try to clarify the definition, and then produce the data in different formats, to be used by different tools, and that, for different use cases. So this kind of tool then can be used to visualize performance at a city scale. And this is just an example. We took San Francisco's disclosure data set. It's about 1,600 buildings, and this particular slide visualize the compliance, status. So I think the orange color shows those are the buildings are still, violating. They are not compliant yet. I think the green one means those are already, complied. And so you can visualize different metrics. It depends on what kind of data you have. We can then evaluate the solar, photovoltaic potential, at a city scale. So this just shows these about 9,000 buildings, and we took a look at what different type of PV system and also how much roof area is available for PV. You can do a quick assessment of how much kilowatt hour, the rooftop PV can generate, for this district or for the entire city, right? So you can color code by those things. And so in this kind of evaluation, I think the solar shading is very important. So we have the geometry data, so basically consider the solar shading, right? If you have a building surrounded by many tall buildings, right, your roof is probably not going to receive a lot of solar. So those kind of impact, I think, needs to be considered. And we use the platform to do some, retrofit studies. So in this case, there's this group of building about 940 office and retail buildings in northeast region of San Francisco. Basically, we're interested in looking at, what are technologies that we can retrofit this building to reduce the energy use by 30 or even 50%, right? So as the table shows, these are technologies sort of, cost effective. If a payback less than 5 years, for this group of buildings in San Francisco, LED lighting means replace lighting, with LED for these 940 buildings. Install some plug load controllers. Basically, turn out some of those are like monitors if nobody's in office, right? Install occupancy sensors, lighting sensors, and do some temperature set point, right? Not necessarily always require 24 degrees Celsius of, comfort temperature, right? If we can relax it to 25 degrees or even 26 degrees, right? There's a significant energy saving potential there. And how about we install airside economizer? So, many old HVAC equipment don't have airside economizer, but in San Francisco climate, outdoor air most of the time, it's cool enough, right, to provide free cooling. So if we retrofit those rooftop units to enable airside economizer, I think there's a significant savings you can get. So if we put all of the 6 majors together, right, these are within payback of 5 years, right, basically we can see, right, every building has a saving potential from 30% all the way to 50%, right? So these are the technology, if you think about, they're nothing new or, or fancy. So I think the technology is there. I think the other challenge is, beyond technology, to actually get the buildings in cities, retrofitted, to meet the current code or to reduce, significantly energy use. So the tool can also visualize the microclimate. I think this particular slide shows the heat wave in 2017 in San Francisco. And this has impact on the building code in, adoption in cities. So even though this is a small area, San Francisco, but because of microclimate, on this very hot day, this is just happened to be the Labor Day. So it shows the city, right, get this 107 degrees Fahrenheit, which basically is the 140 years record. But even during the same day, I think these are facing the Pacific coastal, it's only 87.6. So we easily see there's a 20-degree variation in air temperature across the city. So I think this brings some interesting question about when city adopt the building code, so this kind of microclimate impact be considered and how that should be considered. That's the interest of San Francisco. I want to mention a project. This is part of exascale computing project, and several labs work together. We try to look at all these different sectors in city: transportation, buildings, urban climate, and how people make decisions. The idea is to quantify these interconnections. I think earlier I illustrated building release heat to environment, and environment, of course, right, influence buildings' energy demand. And then transportation, is similar, right? Transportation move people around, but also generates pollutants and heat, right, to cities. So how that should be considered. And especially now we also have electric vehicles that may also, add charging loads to the building and, in a very dynamic way. So how these kind of interactions should be considered, which is important when we're thinking about the urban planning, right? We will try to create a new district. What's the infrastructure needs for this new district? So the last slide, this is just something very new. It's ACEEE, and the Europeans ECEEE, and also India's EEE just came up with this report looking at energy efficiency from a global perspective. buildings consume 31%, industry 29, transportation 29. So they recommended these 12 strategies, for us to, basically to do something, meaningful to scale up our efficiency to the global scale. If you look at the list, I think these are the things, most of the things we already talked about, and so there's challenges still there, and I think a lot is probably beyond just the technology itself, about policy, business model, and how we motivate people and building owners to do it. So I will stop here.
Okay, thank you. So we'll take questions if there's any questions from the audience. Or if there's any questions online. Oh, am I still muted? No.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Are you going to repeat it to him?
Yeah, if you speak up, he might be able to hear, but if not, I'll repeat.
Okay, so in the very beginning, when he gave that comparison between the buildings in the U.S., China, Europe, or the EU, and then Asia, without China, I suppose, it seemed as though the technologies that they were looking at that were presented for high-performance buildings were ones that would rather favor more temperate climates. And I'm curious as to where these buildings are located in those regions to see whether these results could be something that could be applicable to a place like here where we don't have a mild climate.
Were you able to hear the question?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a very good question. So these are definitely, buildings in different climates. So the impact of climate, I think, definitely is a factor. But more important, I think, is the other factors that influence their energy consumption. I think because some of the data here shows basically in the same region, right? And they consume still very different amount of energy. So I think what we found out from comparing buildings in China and buildings in the U.S. and I think the energy consumption is almost like a default by factor of 2. And so we have more advanced energy efficiency technologies and equipment installed. But what we found is we tend to run our equipment in much longer time, and some even we don't turn it off, even though nobody there. And we also condition the entire building, right? And with lower cooling temperature, high heating temperature. So, and while we look at China, I think they don't have as efficient technologies than us, but they operate the buildings in a much more efficient way. Like every day, at the end of the day, they have these operators run around through every room and turn off lights, turn off whatever equipment they are not needed, right? And then you get much more, wider comfort temperature range. So these are a few other things, I think, if you will, operation of people's behavior, whatever, that make the actual energy consumption very different.
Yeah.
I have a question. I want to see this, the consideration about building energy, including the deterioration of the materials. As I think the performance of the building envelope will have a direct impact to the energy, because as the material deteriorates, especially the window, around
The frame.
Beyond the frame, the caulking. So thank you. The caulking, once that deteriorates, then you will have a lot of energy loss. And so I don't see that has been incorporated in this discussion or in his presentation. I'd like to hear from him how he,
So you're talking about the breaching of weather stripping, like the weather
yeah,
sealing
actually that
of
is
the
very
building.
important. And that unfortunately is a minor point, but the deterioration of that caulking is very fast.
Oh yeah.
And no one actually looked at that type of materials because it's such small. I mean, for my whole building, they say, oh, that is just a minor thing, but most of the energy escape is
Yeah.
through the clogging.
So were you able to hear that question?
Yeah, maybe you can clarify or rephrase it.
I think the question was about, going outside of the windows, you could have deterioration over time, and as you do, then the efficiency of the windows is lost because of the deterioration of the materials around it. So do you have anything to say about the sort of degradation of materials in these high-performance buildings over time and how that changes the efficiency? I think that was the question.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, and definitely, I think, window, not necessarily the optical part, but the insulation, right? And then if you have low E or those special coatings, I think, those can, deteriorate as well. But even for opaque, the insulation, we know that depends on installation quality, but also often, some insulation can also be damaged by some of the moisture issues, right? So, that's the R value will be no longer like it's the new design of what we expect, right? And the infiltration, yes, like all buildings, right? If we don't maintain the envelope well, it tends to be much more leaky. And I think we definitely see those kind of data, when, that relates to buildings, vintage and how the building, is maintained.
I've heard in some cases air pollution inside a house is worse than the outside, and if you make a super tight, thick wall house, then that's not healthy. That you need a significant amount of air coming in, though that of course normally means you lose heat. So is there a trade-off? I guess you can say that depending on we in America have a high value of health compared to some others. So is there a trade-off on that issue of maintaining enough circulation to be healthy inside without wasting oil or electric or whatever?
So the question was about the trade-off associated with indoor air quality. If you seal the building too well, you're trapping potentially pollutants, contaminants, things that are not good for your health inside the building. And is there a trade-off on insulation versus indoor air quality?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think it is a great question. So, especially the new buildings, our code is getting so aggressive, if you will, but in terms of installation, and indeed, I think the infiltration is also reduced quite significantly, and which means then we rely more on this active ventilation, right, to control the indoor pollution, right? So, I think the code, right, is energy code after 90.1, and then ventilation code 62, right, 0.1 for commercial, 0.2 for residential. So they try to evaluate, all the trade-off, between the time and envelope and what kind of ventilation we should put in place, right? Before, right, a leaky building actually good from perspective of, maintaining the indoor air quality. But now if everything gets tight and gets very chill, I think we have to make sure we be able to provide, the ventilation in an active and controlled way. The other related issue is also we tighten the envelope, or we have very high insulation. I think this may be more happening in those mild climates, maybe San Francisco or even Europe. They're talking a lot about it. It's the summer overheating, right? Most of the homes or buildings don't have air conditioning, and if you have very insulated envelope, you can easily get overheated during the summertime. So I think it's all these things that we need to consider together. And it's not just the energy use, it's the occupant comfort, and it's also early mentioned demand flexibility, as well as resilience we talk about, right? Some measures may not save energy, but can be very good in terms of the resilience to extreme, weather events, like, very cold, very hot, days.
Can I ask a follow-up on that? I was talking to an HVAC expert recently who was talking about a trade-off in terms of moisture. That the ventilation sounds great, but if that causes moisture to enter the building, then the energy required to remove the moisture to create the comfort, offsets the any savings that you might have had just for natural ventilation. Is that true only in certain climates, or is it true in many climates? That was a curious argument to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it depends on cases. Maybe the humid climate, which requires more deep humidification, maybe they will be more picky in terms of how you provide the ventilation air. I think that the standard 62.1 also allows you to do the filtration, so you don't need to always use 100% outdoor air. You can have portion, recirculation air get filtered, get treated in a way that can also meet some of the ventilation requirements. I think, for example, like in California, we have this wildfire, and sometimes outdoor air quality can be terrible. So in those situations, right, we try to basically, get the outdoor air damper closed and try to filter the recirculation air to provide a ventilation.
Go ahead, more.
Can I ask another
Yeah,
one?
of course, go ahead.
Okay, this is maybe something he cannot answer, but I was wondering if he had something to say about the fact that when we green buildings or try to go towards more energy efficiency, what we're doing is increasing the value of that building, which then leads to gentrification, which then leads to basically moving people who are not able to afford these higher quality buildings to live in those spaces. Is there a way that we're able to actually deal with climate change and greening that doesn't marginalize communities that cannot afford to live in good housing?
So you're getting lots of trade-off questions. So in this one, trading off and high performance buildings for real estate or for access to real estate and gentrification.
Oh, you mean how that valuation of high-performance building, right, in the assessment of real estate?
But I think the question was, if you make buildings higher performing, you generally make them more expensive, and then you change you change who's able to live there. So in the context of sort of social dimensions of sustainability, how do high performance buildings fit in?
Yeah. There is definitely, I think, a very interesting perspective of looking at energy efficiency. And I think if you look at the real estate market now, I think there's a very little link, right? Your home is much more energy efficient. Does it get a higher valuation? Probably not. Or does it get a lower mortgage rate? Maybe not, right? So we have a scientist here from Matthew is working with UC Berkeley's Hart Business School and trying to look at how these energy efficiencies could be valued as part of the real estate assessment. And they're looking at some interesting data points, looking at if a building is a very lousy in terms of consuming lots of energy, right? And there's a significant high portion of energy costs, right? Utility costs. And how does that influence the default rate, of the mortgage? And they found some interesting points, and I think they try to make a justification that in the future, these are real estate valuation should have one factor of energy efficiency.
Good.
Can I just respond to that and then ask a question?
Sure.
I think one thing from his presentation too is just when you look at the energy code, like ultimately the base code of how all buildings is going to be more efficient until it's net zero. So there wouldn't be a trade-off there for some people being able to afford more, because all buildings should be the same amount of efficient in the future.
Those were commercial and residential, right? Or not necessarily big versus small. Like, did I get that right? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are buildings at different size, but they're all commercial.
Okay. But are you saying that the residential
There
codes
are
for
commercial and residential codes.
and they're both heading down?
Right.
Okay.
That's the goal. But my question is about the city building Energy Saver and just access to the tool. If anyone can use it, you gave examples of San Francisco and looking at what a large like retrofit program, how much energy could be saved. I'm just curious for Philadelphia, if we could do that kind of modeling with this tool.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. So I think that the process we work with you city's consultants basically try to put the data together and upload to the platform, and then that can be used. So we developing data, I think for 1,000 cities, few in California, but it's also New York City, Chicago, and I believe Washington D.C. and Boston. So yeah, if you are interested, I think we definitely can find a time to chat with you. But I think it's our interest to get the tool platform to be used by as many people as possible, and it's provided free. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, because we have a benchmarking program here in the city, so we have a lot of data already to go from.
Yeah, that would be good to have a follow-up chat.
Can I ask just one question, also going back to the very beginning of your presentation where you talked briefly about, when you were talking about the different energy metrics and you briefly mentioned the life cycle assessment. And I'm just wondering, one of the questions that I ask myself a lot when people talk about net zero buildings is how much they're really just talking about operations of the building. And if I were to expand the sort of control volume that I'm thinking about to include the sourcing of the materials that are required to build the high performance buildings and transport that material to the site, and then the ultimate decommissioning of the building and disposal, does that blow this argument out of the water? In other words, are we, do the life cycle of the entire, does the full life cycle of the construction of high performance buildings makes it really not look so net zero at the end of the day?
Yeah, that's so some very high level data. I think like for most of the buildings, I think at the moment, right, we're talking about 80% of life cycle energy is operational, right? But
Okay.
now we are pushing aggressive, right, to net zero energy. Basically, those embodied energy or embodied carbon emission now is getting a much, much higher fraction. They're getting to almost 50%.
So you're saying originally it was 80-20 and now it's kind of 50-50. The latest analysis is that
Yes, so those are some data we saw, yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you. Oh, we have one more question. Go ahead.
There's a comment.
Comment.
An institution gives a 10% bonus to the maintenance man on energy saving. That whatever the energy savings that he's coming up with, he's getting a 10% bonus based on that. And to me, that is probably the most efficient, immediate way of becoming more energy efficient.
Incentivizing the building operator.
Making maximum use of the existing facilities. And in attempting to get a bonus, that individual will go around and find the leaking windows, the lights that are left on, or the equipment that is kept running. So someone that has an economic incentive to make the building more efficient, I think is the best immediate return on your money.
Great point.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well with that, I think we should move to our next presenter. So thank you very much for that presentation.
Thank you.
There was a chat.
Aaron,
Okay.
Jenny can share, yeah.
Okay, so I will switch to Dr. Reyna. Okay, I think we should be able to hear you. Although I can't hear you yet. Not hearing you.
And also, I unmuted myself.
Ah, there you go. Yep, go ahead and share your screen. Okay, I think, yeah, let me
Can you
just,
see it?
yeah, I'm just trying to minimize the, Oops, what did I do? Sorry. Messed up.
Oh, no.
Should I get rid of that? Oh, enter full screen.
There
we go.
It might be on my end.
No, that was on us.
Oh,
Well, that's the wrong one, isn't it?
yeah. Swap, there you go.
Okay.
Perfect, you're up.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you all. So today I'm going to be talking about two different tools that have been developed at NREL for the modeling of the residential stock and modeling of the commercial stock. Before I get into that, I want to give a little bit of motivation for why we care about modeling the stock and kind of the important things that we want to be capturing in our modeling. This is probably a fairly familiar figure to a lot of you. This is a breakdown of energy consumption in the United States. In blue there, you can see the residential and commercial building sectors. Combined, they consume about 40% of energy in the U.S. and contribute about 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, it's broken up across many different end uses, but space heating, space cooling, and lighting tend to be some of the biggest drivers. Another thing to note is that buildings consume about 75% of our electricity in the United States. And given these huge energy numbers, any effort to seriously decarbonize our economy has to take buildings very seriously, both in terms of like their potential for reduction, as well as the needs in the buildings. So kind of what are the potentials for savings in the U.S.? This is a study that was actually led out of LDNL that I was on that we came out with, looking at the potential for CO2 savings in the U.S. So we ran a bunch of different scenarios using different combinations of technologies. And we found just through technologies alone, using either existing on the market technologies or near-term things that should come out in the next few years, we could pretty easily reduce around 26 to 30% of our current carbon emissions. However, if we were to combine that with a decarbonization of the electricity supply, remembering that buildings consume 75% of electricity, plus we were pushing fuel switching, so increasing the fraction of energy consumed in the building as electricity, we can actually get to nearly 80% savings in our most aggressive scenario. So all this is to say that there's huge potentials for saving across different technologies in the building stock in the U.S. However, those savings are not equally distributed across space or time. So this is per capita tons of CO2 emissions in buildings from 2016, reported by EIA. You can see that there's wide variation looking all the way up at Wyoming, which is like 55 metric tons per person, all the way down to California, which is like 2. And this isn't only the technology of the stock itself. There's lots of factors that go into this: the mix of building types, the climate, the technologies deployed, the fuel mixes, the behavior, many different things that go into this. But it's important to remember that the opportunities for greenhouse gas savings are not equally distributed across the country. Additionally, there's a lot of variation in time. So this is CAISO, which is the California Independent System Operator. This is their average electricity production in the summer of 2016. So as you can see, at different times in the day, there's many different types of generation online. You know, solar is obviously only online when the sun is up. And so the corresponding carbon intensity, it really varies quite a bit depending upon the hour of the day. And this profile will look quite different if you were to look at like New England, for example. In addition to the variations in carbon intensity, there's also really large variations in wholesale electricity price. This is a fairly old graph from ERCOT. It's from 2016. ERCOT is the Texas grid. So this is Texas. And you can see that across different points in time, the wholesale price of electricity varies quite substantially. If you see that little dashed line, that's the average retail price that the customer is paying. And if you see the black spikes that are happening, this is the real-time market, what the price of electricity ended up being in the market in 2016. And this is actually quite outdated. This summer, ERCOT went up to $9,000 a megawatt hour. So basically, not only is it really important to understand when energy savings are happening from a carbon perspective, there's also huge cost savings potential from, imagine look at that spike in May, if we were able to reduce building energy consumption even a fraction, the cost savings from that would be huge at the system level. So there's potential for both carbon reduction as well as cost reduction across systems. So in order to decarbonize buildings, we really need to understand many different things. We need to understand where energy demand is happening, when energy demand is happening, how it varies by different building types, technology types, fuel types, and also looking at the timing of different energy efficiency measures. If I was to upgrade, let's say, the washing machine in my home to a more efficient model, I might be able to do some back of the envelope calculation in terms of the energy savings based on the rating of the washer. However, what is the actual carbon savings from that? Looking at the electricity demand needed to run the washing machine, it's going to vary a lot depending upon my behavior, my location, many, many different things. And at an aggregate level across the country, this isn't something we necessarily have a good understanding of what are these different time-sensitive savings. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about RESTOC and COMSTOC and kind of what we're doing, kind of going from the nationwide down, trying to understand some of these regional and differences in energy consumption. So RESTOC and COMSTOC, these are models of the residential and commercial building sectors, respectively, in the United States. And they use physics-based energy models to model the whole stock. So this is kind of a traditional approach that's been used for maybe 15, 20 years to use physics-based individual building models that you do building energy simulation for a year. Then you go to your larger building stock and say, okay, so for 1970s single-family homes, I've created this prototypical model. I then map all the 1970 buildings in the country to my prototype and scale it up to get a national total. And RESTOC and COMSTOC are doing a version of this, but in a much more sophisticated way, by not just using a single archetype or prototype to represent a whole segment of the stock, but actually using a suite of different prototypes. So as opposed to using maybe 30 to represent the country, we're using hundreds of thousands of individual models. So these are RESTOC and COMSTOC are DOE-funded and NREL-developed models of the U.S. building stock. We use OpenStudio and Energy Plus under the hood on these. So this is Tianzin introduced Energy Plus, and we're doing this for many, many different types of buildings throughout the country. And one of the advantages to using Energy Plus is that we get hourly outputs or even 15-minute outputs if we want them. Our calibration to date has been primarily focused on getting annual totals right, but we're increasingly interested and have several projects moving it towards time series calibration. I'm going to talk about some of those in a little bit. So why do we need these hundreds of thousands of representative models? Isn't it good enough to just say, let's model a typical 1970s single-family home and call it good enough? And actually, not so much. One of the things that we're trying to avoid is called the flaw of averages. Some of you might have seen this plot before. All of the different representations of the points here have different means and have the same mean and standard deviation. However, the shapes are quite different. So for example, a typical 1970s single-family home in the U.S. might use natural gas heating. However, to represent every single 1970s single-family home as having natural gas heating, you're really glossing over the distribution that really exists within that segment of the building stock. So our approach is to develop a very highly granular model that allows nationwide totals, but as well as looking at local and regional differences. So the first thing we do in developing the models is we have put together a nationwide characteristic database. So I'm using RESTOC as an example here. As full disclosure, I work on the residential buildings team, so this is going to be a little bit more slanted towards RESTOC and the residential side of things than the commercial side of things. So the first thing we do is we use a wide range of different data that are available on the U.S. housing stock to develop the residential side of things, from home builder surveys, the American Community Survey, large-scale residential energy consumption survey, weather data, and piecing these things together to develop a database we can sample from of the U.S. building stock. Oh no. Can you all hear me? Sorry, I think I might have lost connection for a second. Can you still see my slides? Okay, let me try that again. Okay, how's that? Okay, great. Okay, so we developed this database of the housing stock. So kind of what does this look like? So for example, this might be the breakdown across the country of different types of residential buildings. 48% single-family detached, various different breakdowns of single-family attached and multifamily. So we get this probability distribution of a single building falling within any one of these categories. So then we might take that single-family detached portion, and then we have within that for single-family detached a distribution of where these buildings are located. So then, for example, if we were to take the Mid-Atlantic region, which has 8% of the single-family homes in the U.S., we then can break that down by vintage. You kind of can see how this is going, that we can keep breaking it out step by step to get these networks of conditional probability distributions that represent the entire residential stock of the U.S. And this is just a sampling of them. We have about 150 different inputs to the model that actually makes up these distributions. So then once we have these conditional probability distributions built out, we can sample from them. So using the example we just had, so if we were to develop a building that is a 1980s Mid-Atlantic single-family home, the most typical combination would be a gas heating fuel, R30 attic, R11 walls, double pane windows, CR10 air conditioner, and 80% AFUE furnace. So this is the most typical. So if we were doing a more traditional archetypical approach, this would just represent that whole segment of the stock. But what we actually do is we do a whole bunch of different samples. So we might get a case that is not the most common or most high probability. So that's why we do hundreds of thousands of samples so that we're able to fully capture the distribution that exists within the stock. So once we sample from these characteristics, we have a set of about 350,000 building characteristics, each one that represents a single home. And then what we do is for each one of these is we create an Energy Plus model via Open Studio, and we do a simulation for each one of those buildings. And within this, we're able to get 15-minute results for all the different end uses within a building. So this is just an example showing 3 different end uses broken out, but we actually can do much more than that. But we get these time series results for each of the buildings that we've sampled from. We do the simulations we actually perform on we have a supercomputer at NREL that we typically use for our simulations. So for the residential stock, just to do single family homes, it's about 350,000 Energy Plus models to represent the whole US. If we were then to go and take that stock and do different upgrades, so like ask questions like what if we were to upgrade a certain portion of insulation in homes across the US, what would that look like? So if we were to do 50 different upgrades and kind of explore the nationwide impacts of that, it actually goes up to 20 million different simulations and almost 2.5 years of computing time. We also have workflows that develop to use cloud computing for this, in addition to just our supercomputer here. And we're working to develop those further so that this is a tool that's easier for those outside the lab to be able to use. One thing that we've been thinking a lot about, ResStock and ComStock were initially developed as nationwide models, but there's a lot of potential for doing citywide analysis. Last year, we partnered with New York City to write a support document to talk about what would a city actually need to do to prepare to do a city scale analysis. NREL has already contracted with one city to do a city scale analysis that I'm going to talk about next. But in general, if anybody else was interested in doing this, like what would it take in terms of what data would they need to collect? What are the local organizations and partners that they need to have on board? What types of questions should they be asking? What types of answers could they get with the model? And so this is online if you're interested, and I can also send it out. And also, as I mentioned, ResStock is available online. You can it's not commercial grade software, but it is up there. We also have a web page with some results already loaded that you could go and kind of play around with and look at some different nationwide results that we have developed. ComStock is a little bit further behind ResStock in development, so it's not fully available yet, but the intent is for it to be usable by those outside of NREL as well. So with that, I'm going to talk about I have 2 projects I'm going to talk about today. So So this is one project that we did with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, looking at some of their goals of getting to 100% renewable energy. So the LA 100 project is much larger than just building load modeling, although we are a portion of it. The study is really interested in looking at how can we get to 100% clean energy in LA. And from the buildings perspective, we're really interested in looking at the role that buildings play in getting to that. As I mentioned, across the US, buildings are about 75% of electricity demand. So from an electric utility perspective, it's really important to understand how building loads are going to change into the future to be able to plan for that. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that as well, depending on policy and new technologies and all sorts of things. So we developed a range of different demand side scenarios for buildings to kind of look at the different ranges that might need to happen on the supply side to be meeting the future demands in the building sector. The LA 100 study also had some really interesting aspects that it wasn't just technology focused. There was also some work around environmental justice, how the impact on local economy, what's the impact on the ratepayer. So it was a large comprehensive study, and parts of it are still ongoing. But for our portion, we used ResStock and Comstock to generate hourly load shapes, so 8,760 hourly points per year for all the way through 2045 for some different scenarios. So how do we go about this? So as I mentioned, with the housing characteristics, conditional dependencies that I broke down a little bit, we basically went through and we, instead of using US national data, we started pulling in California and Los Angeles specific data, information from the LA assessor on their building stock, some of their different GIS data portal information, basically wherever we could to update our representation of the housing stock to match what happened in LA. California is a unique situation that they have their own building surveys that were really useful for developing some of these characteristics. They have a specific survey focused on the residential stock of California, even down selected to LADWP specifically. But wherever we could, we went through and we tried to update our national level characteristics to represent the LA stock. And as I mentioned, we developed multiple demand side scenarios going forward, and other portions of the NREL team developed supply side scenarios as well to kind of look at some of the different things that were in play. So, but before we could get to developing some of these future scenarios, the first thing we did was take a look at how we built out this characteristic database of buildings in LA, and we ran it for 2012 and compared it to the real data, and just kind of to see how are we doing when we started off. So you can see we were a little bit too high during the day, a little bit too low at night. So we had some work to do to try to true up our models and identify those discrepancies. One of the things we did during the calibration process is we ended up using 2016 load research data, which is LADWP's research that suggests that this is what they think their 2016 load actually was. LADWP does not have advanced metering infrastructure in every single building. They have a small subset. So what they have is monthly billing data, is the ground truth data that they have. But they do have this LRD load research data where they've gone out and done a small sample of buildings that they think represent it, and they scale it up to the total load. So we use this LRD data in 2016 as our ground truth to train the model and do the calibration. We then tested it in 2017. And then we also did a portion of validation off of the monthly customer billing data. Because LADWP is obviously interested in the load shapes for doing 100% renewable energy studies, since they're interested in knowing when demand is happening. But the billing data is a good validation for the years that we have it to make sure that we are getting the aggregate totals right. So I think I mentioned this. We use the LRD data. We use the customer building data. We also, there was a small subset of LADWP that has advanced metering infrastructure, which is 15-minute metered data at the individual building level. It's not very much of their service territory, but we used it for a comparison where we had it. It's also not a statistically representative sample of the city, so we couldn't just scale it up and say, here's LADWP's profile. So to give you an example of some of the things we did during the calibration process to try to improve our model. So this is our distribution table for infiltration. So you can see the infiltration, the different options are across the columns at the top. And the if you see vintage is listed on the left, that's so infiltration is dependent upon the vintage of the residential building. So this was originally what we had. It was from the house simulation protocols. It was all of California averaged together. It was a pretty basic regression equation. As you can see, there's not a lot of diversity in this. It's pretty simplified considering the diversity within LA stock. But this is what's in our national level model. When you're looking at national totals, maybe less important. But when we were drilling down to LA specific, we needed something that had more detail. So we ended up remodeling this using an envelope leakage tool for LA specifically. And then we were able to take those distributions and update the infiltration. As you can see, it covers a much wider range of the infiltration space, and ended up being something really important in our models. So we were able to update this. So we went through, we ended up doing around 30 different iterations of input changes. I do have to say that these are example calibration results. The project's not final, so none of the graphs I show in here are final results. But to give you an idea of kind of how we ended up doing, here is the 2016 training and the 2017 test. So overall, we're doing fairly okay in matching our LRD data. I do have to say we had some interesting surprises during the calibration. There were factors that were LA specific that ended up being really important for LA that are not necessarily important nationwide. Two of the things that were biggest surprises for us that we had to get right was pool energy consumption. There's a high number of pools in LA, and for the homes that have them, they're really high energy consumption. We look across the whole country, like there's overall not that many pools, not that high a fraction of homes have pools. But because of the pool density in LA, getting the pool heating and pool pump schedules correct were really important. Another thing that became a big surprise to us is holiday lights were really important in LA. And it's one of the things that we had to actually add on to our models to account for correctly, because it was not something captured by our lighting module previously. So once we have the calibrated baseline, we then developed projections of 2015 through 2045. So we did this period to go into the future. And we did a range of different load cases. So we did a reference, which was supposed to be kind of existing and near-term technologies, things we knew that were coming up in the building code in California. Then we did a moderate. This was both moderate energy efficiency and moderate electrification of different end uses. Buildings in LA still use a considerable amount of natural gas, and one of the scenarios LA DWP wanted us to look at was switching some of those natural gas loads over to electricity and kind of looking at what that would look like. The high case was both high efficiency as well as high electrification. So kind of from a emissions perspective, probably one of the better cases, because you're reducing the demand a lot and you're switching it over to electricity, which is going to be modeled as renewable in the other portions of the project. And then we also included a stress case. This case was where you do the high electrification, you switch over all your building loads, but you're not tackling efficiency in the same aggressive manner. So this is kind of a worst case for the electric grid. You suddenly have all these new electric loads, but you're not offsetting any of it with efficiency. And kind of what does that do to peak, and how bad can things get? So with each of these scenarios, we set up the end goals we wanted to get to, and then backcast the adoption rates in order to get to those certain levels of electrification or efficiency we wanted to see in the stock. So it wasn't a market competition or anything like that. All of these were modeled. We weren't modeling specific policies. We weren't modeling specific market mechanisms. We were just trying to provide a range of potential reasonable scenarios that we might see in the building sector going forward. One of the things we had to be responsive to as well, LA came out with their Green New Deal midway through this project, which mandates for buildings to be net carbon neutral by 2050. That's a little bit open to interpretation, how you want to think about what net carbon neutral is. We assumed it was for 100% electrification of the building stock. We weren't assuming any other, accounting mechanisms that allowed natural gas to stay. So for our high electrification case, we were trying to get to 100% electrified by the end, assuming that you couldn't be burning natural gas in the building and be net carbon neutral. So how do we actually go about doing these projections? So we had 3 different parts of kind of this forecasting module. The first one was actually based on just growth of the building stock. What are the retirement rates? What are the growth rates? And we used projections on population from the California Department of Finance primarily to feed this, as well as population estimates from the American Community Survey to model the turnover of buildings within the stock. We then put in our electrification goals for different scenarios. For the reference case, it was basically no electrification. For moderate, it was kind of what we considered low-hanging fruit electrification. And then for the stress and the high case, it was pushing to 100% where we could by the end of the period. There's a few technologies where we actually really struggled to get them into the stock in time because we were replacing them basically at the end of life of the different equipment. And then on top of that, we had another piece of the model that was doing efficiency upgrades. So some of the near-term ones based on what currently exists in Title 24, which is the California Building Code, and Title 20, which is the California Appliance Standards, as well as things that are in federal appliance standards. And then we also did some more aggressive cases where we were bumping it up beyond, for the moderate and high, beyond what we believed were the near-term changes. So here's what our growth projections look like. You can see on the left here, the different colors are different vintages of buildings, with the orange and red colored ones being the new construction going forward. And that projection matches with the California Department of Finance in terms of the total, and then we modeled the vintage turnover within that. And then you can kind of see the breakdown on the right graph here of the different types of buildings, multifamily versus single family. You can see a big growth in multifamily in the LA area. We were assuming partly driven by the price of housing and availability of land and so forth. For electrification, these are the different end uses within buildings. So the ones that we considered for our electrification modules, for commercial, we did kind of miscellaneous natural gas loads, heating natural gas, and water heating natural gas. For residential, we considered pools, major appliances, primarily cooking ranges and dryers, space heating, and water heating. So this is a sample of one of the electrification scenarios. This is cooking ranges for residential stock. You can see the orange here is electric, the fraction that's electric, and the blue is the fraction that's natural gas. On the left-hand graph here, you're seeing the actual sales. As I mentioned, the way that we were getting equipment into the stock was based on the natural turnover of the equipment. So basically, EIA reports the average lifetime of different equipment, and we use that as our typical. So if a cooking range lasts on average 15 years, at the end of 15 years, we had a replacement based on these sales that we were projecting. So then on the right, based on that lifetime turnover, here's what actually gets installed into the stock. And in the case of cooking ranges, we got to 100% electric pretty readily by 2045, assuming that all sales go electric by 2030. That was the only way we could get some of these technologies into the stock. We actually struggled with electrification of some things like space heating, because natural gas space heating equipment lasts quite long, on average around like 22 years. So getting to 100% electric by the end of the study period was really difficult, because we were assuming that they couldn't go 100% electric sales within the next 5 years or so. So we didn't quite make it for some of those, which is caveated in some of our results. Here's an example of what some of the efficiency looks like. So this is showing attic insulation in residential buildings, showing improvements with the darker colors being higher insulation levels. Some improvements in the reference case, increasing amounts within the moderate and high. We made some assumptions that the attics that were going to be insulated first for the poorly insulated ones, not the moderately insulated ones, and really pushing those to high insulation levels. So unfortunately, the study is not finalized, and so I cannot show you any official results. We're hoping that we're going to be able to start publishing on those in the next year or so. But this is to give you an example of kind of what some of the results of the study are going to look like. So here's a week in February 2015 that we modeled. You can see it's broken down by different end uses. We have outdoor air temperatures. We know different zone temperatures for the building. This is just, for a week, and you see some of the variations in load, and you can see what's driving that. And so we're going to have this for both the residential and commercial stock all the way through 2045 for each of those different scenarios I talked about, so that our grid modeling team and LDWP are able to explore what different kind of building efficiency features and building electrification features look like, and what the implications are for how they're going to have to build out their grid to meet those. So again, I apologize, stay tuned. Study results are not yet public. The building loads are more or less complete, but other portions of the project are still ongoing, and hopefully those will be out sometime in the next year. You'll start seeing some of those results out. I'm also going to talk about another ongoing project that we're doing with Rostock. Tianzin's actually a team member on this project as well, but it's being led out of NREL, and we have a website for this project if you'd like to go and take a look. And the aim of this project is modeling end-use load profiles for the United States. So what is an end-use load profile? End-use load profiles describe how and when energy is used. So it's kind of similar to like what I was just showing you for the LA specific model, but it's more generalizing how energy is going to be used. So for example, back to my clothes washers example that I gave, it'd be able to tell me if I was to upgrade my, if you were to upgrade a certain portion of clothes washers in the United States, when would you see the savings, and what would that look like in terms of the time-sensitive savings? So this has a lot of different applications. Utilities are especially interested in this. A lot of utility costs is driven by the worst couple of hours a year. And if they were able to shave off some of the demand at those hours of year, there's huge implications in terms of how much they have to build out their system and the cost savings. And so they are very interested in understanding, what are the different end uses that are driving that peak, and what are the different end uses driving demand at different times of day. And so we are developing this for the United States. There's a strong market need for this. The states shaded in green have some level of load profiles already developed in public. There's big differences between the different regions in terms of like the number of profiles, how actually accessible they are, how representative they are. LBNL has done an inventory on the existing things that are out there. But even with the green shaded states, you can see that there's large portions of the country that are just not currently covered under the current load profiles that are out there that might actually have very big differences in the profile of their consumption. So this project is to address that gap. It's a 3-year DOE project led by NREL Buildings. It's about $9 million. And we have 60 different advisory members from industry, from nonprofits, from public utility commissions that are basically advising us as we develop these profiles. Our project team is composed of NREL, as well as LBNL and Argonne National Laboratories. We're also partnered with NEEP, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, as well as EPRI. So some of the challenge in developing these types of load profiles. So why don't these things already exist for large portions of the U.S.? Traditionally, they've been done by taking a representative sample of the buildings, going in and installing sub-meters, so meters for each of the different end uses within the building, monitoring them for a year, and then scaling it up to represent a whole region. And this has been done predominantly in the Pacific Northwest. There are some that exist for the Northeast as well. The problem with this approach is that it's extremely expensive to go and actually meter each of these buildings. So the opportunity of this project is to do a hybrid approach by using meter data where we have it, by using AMI data where we have it, and calibrating the Rostock and Comstock models in a time series way, which hasn't been done as much before outside of Los Angeles, to develop these profiles using the model. One of the advantages of this approach also is that then you can run different scenarios of savings. It's not part of the scope of this project, but something that we're thinking about for the future. So this project will produce end-use load profiles by region, by actual end use, water heating, HVAC, appliances, et cetera, and by building type, which is especially important for the commercial building sector that has many different types of buildings with very different use profiles. We will be using a hybrid approach by using the studies that exist, by working with utilities to get AMI data where they have it, as well as the existing load research data that might be out there. It's a really novel approach that's going to give a national data set at a fraction of the cost of previous studies. One of the other advantages of the way that we're modeling this is I mentioned RESOC does hundreds of thousands of simulations. So as opposed to getting like some sort of average, like here's electric water heating in single family homes in, let's say Massachusetts, for example, we actually, or I guess this example is Denver, so let's say Denver. So as opposed to here's the average electric water heating consumption in Denver, we're actually able to then look at each of the different buildings and how they contribute to that aggregate, and then also looking at the variation that exists building to building. So it's actually a really unique thing. And the more detailed you get spatially, so if you look not just at the whole utility level, if you start looking at the feeder level, understanding the variability in that individual profile becomes increasingly important. And that's something that we'll get as a byproduct of the way that we're doing the modeling. Yeah, so for example, we can trace it down to an individual building within each of those profiles. Some of the goals of this is we would like to have our results at 15-minute resolution for a whole year. Where possible, we're trying to provide results at the utility territory level. And we're focusing on real power, not reactive power for this project. We are 1 year into the project right now. We've just released our first year one report. If you're interested in checking that out for what we've already done to date. As I mentioned, we're using a variety of different data sources for calibrating. I touched on some of this with the LA project. One of the data sources we didn't have for LA that we're pursuing heavily is a large comprehensive AMI, which is 15-minute building level data for whole utility territories. Not all utilities have this, but where they do, it's really helpful for us in being able to calibrate not just the aggregate total of our stock model, but the diversity across different buildings. We're also benchmarking against utility sales data reported to EIA every year, load research data where we have it, and sometimes sub-meter data. Pacific Northwest has strong sub-meter data sets. There's a couple scattered throughout the US that we'll use where possible. So to kind of give a quick example, we might take load research data with all of the different customer class profiles and slice our model to try to match that. So for example, a lot of LRD data will give not just residential total, but they might do residential homes that have electric heat, those that don't have electric heat, and trying to as much as possible match that. For some utilities, for example, ComEd, we do have their entire AMI data set. So for all 4 million buildings in Northern Illinois at 30-minute intervals. And so we're able to go through and use that in doing the diversity of the stock. We're also using NEA's 2011 study, which is a sub-metering study. So we actually know things at the end use level. As I mentioned, we're just starting out the second year of this project. So we've really, we spent the first year collecting data, figuring out requirements from different stakeholders, and we're really just now starting to dive into the calibration of the models as part of this. I do want to put a plug in since I have a lot of people on the phone. If you're aware of any potential utility AMI data, please let us know. Like we're very interested in partnering with different utilities. If you're aware of any utilities that would be interested in a project like this, please point them in our direction. We also have an ongoing project mailing list. If you're interested in what's going on in the project, you can sign up on the project website from this. So I hope that gave you kind of a flavor of some of the modeling work going on at NREL and kind of the potential of some of these types of models. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you. We'll open it up to any questions. Are there online questions?
There is a comment and question.
Okay, we'll take the online comment and question.
Do you want me to just read the comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
So that Jenny here. So we have a comment and question from a YouTube viewer. So I'm just going to read this thread. So the solar contracts people who understand, share the same value, and share the same values. Gentrification does, this was from before when we were having a conversation about gentrification and rising house prices. So the solar contracts to people who understand and share the same values. Gentrification does nothing but displace the poor, empower the rich. Sustainability and renewable resources should cater to all. There's many non-corporate solar companies that would benefit Philadelphia's overall business and residential buildings. And we want people who represent our values and bottom line to power up our city. So I don't know if Janet or Jen, if you have anything in response to that. And also, an unrelated question, Janet, are you saying that new buildings are more beneficial for renewable energy than existing buildings?
We'll start with that one.
Yeah, okay.
So I don't know if beneficial is the right word. I'm not sure that we'd ever see any sort of policy anywhere in the U.S. that like demolish our existing stock and build new buildings. So I'm not sure that's the most. Building codes have become much more aggressive, as Tianjin showed, and I think that's a great thing. But I think that any serious policy needs to consider the existing stock and what do you do with the buildings that already exist. Because I think there's a lot of we don't care about building stock only because of energy consumption. There's many other things that that might make a building valuable, historic context, and all the different myriad of functions. So I don't think that the right way to think about it is like, are new buildings good and old buildings bad? I think the right way to think about it is, okay, so for stock growth, what are the right ways to think about building codes for building out new buildings in the right way? And this is especially true in areas of the country that are growing very rapidly, predominantly in the South and the West. But any sort of decarbonization, renewable energy policy has to consider what do you do with existing stock? What is the right way to retrofit? What's the right way to do it in a way that is equitable, that does result in carbon reductions? So it's not, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's coming up with different strategies for how do you impact existing stock, because it's just not going to disappear.
Thanks. I had a question. You showed so many graphs of, so many different appliances and decisions and sectors. I was just wondering if there were any sort of no-brainer substitutions that should be done in new or old, well, I guess mainly in old buildings, for systems or appliances that may not be anywhere near the end of their useful life, but where, if you look at it sort of from a life cycle assessment perspective, the residual value, it is just not worth it in terms when you turn it into energy, and that we should just swap out that sort of antiquated product now. Were there any sort of things that just fell to the top, and no matter which way you cut it, no matter where you are, it just makes sense to do these substitutions now?
So I would not say I wouldn't give like a blanket response and say like every building in the U.S. should replace this system. What I would say is that the majority of energy efficiency upgrades are cost effective with payback periods, on the order of like 5 to 10 years. Not everything, but many things. Some of the big things that contribute large amounts to energy consumption, the thermal envelope, especially in the residential sector. So things to insulation is like a huge payback for most homes, especially in cold climates. Air sealing, and reducing that air leakage. There was an earlier discussion on ventilation and air quality. Most single-family buildings that are existing, you struggle to get it tight enough to where you have serious air quality problems. But there's, insulation, air sealing, kind of things that improve the thermal envelope generally, I'd say, would float to the top. But it's not necessarily like a one-size-fits-all. In terms of your point on the life cycle energy consumption, a lot of things are not evaluated at the life cycle level. As Tianjin mentioned, operational energy use is kind of, it really dominates the life cycle, although that really depends on the life of the building and the life of the equipment. Without having done the calculations, my instinct is that for most of these things, it's going to be better to replace them now as opposed to letting them live out the end of their life cycle. Thinking back to Tianjin's graph on electric lighting, like looking at the difference between incandescent bulbs and LED light bulbs. the savings are just so great over the operational life. Even with the increased manufacturing energy costs that is associated with that, you're going to be better off replacing them immediately. LED lighting, I suppose, is one that would say is low-hanging fruit, although most people have already done that to a large extent.
But in your analysis with the gas ranges, it sounded like, if I understood that one graphic, you were saying, no, the last ones that are put in 2030, the assumption was that they wouldn't be substituted out until 2045, so that an appliance like that, I'm guessing, from a life cycle perspective, it would be the opposite. In other words, you got it, stick with it, use it until it needs to be replaced.
So we weren't assuming that. We were doing that just because we were assuming there wouldn't be any sort of incentive for a customer to go replace something before its end of life. We were assuming that that a homeowner is going to continue to use their range until it doesn't work anymore. So that's when people usually replace things, is like when it's dead. Like you replace your furnace when your furnace breaks. Although there are potential policy mechanisms and there would be energy benefits to replacing things earlier, the practicality of actually getting that in place is much more difficult.
I just, just in view of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, right? You are getting up to 2045, which is sort of around the point where we need to be net zero globally. So,
yep.
To me, those assumptions about behavior, we kind of have to challenge them if we're going to take that, that goal seriously, right? In other words, it may be. I wonder if the answer to this question starts to change as you go further in the future. Right now, sure, let your range go to the end of its useful life. But if you buy one next year, the urgency with which you might be asked to replace it could get greater, I guess.
Yeah, and I agree with you. From a climate change perspective, these things should be happening faster. In the context of this project, our client was LEDWP, and they're interested in what's realistic. And barring any sort of, major incentive from the utility or some sort of policy that comes out in California or LA, mandating these, lifetime is probably when things are going to be replaced. So I would completely agree. From a climate perspective, things are, more dire and probably should be considered. But in terms of developing something that was responsive to actual things that might happen, lifetime is where we got it.
Two more questions, go ahead.
Related to that discussion, so in Pennsylvania or in Philadelphia specifically, we have the issue of, we have a ton of natural gas and we have a ton of natural gas money. And we have, in Philadelphia, we own the natural gas utility. And so are either the presenters aware of innovative solutions to electrify space heating and water heating systems more quickly than we're on track? I mean, we're not on track to do anything that I'm aware of. So we need to move that based on what you're saying about climate change. We need to move that quickly. And we need to steal some ideas or find some ideas in other places to move our policymakers along. So.
I'm not sure if there's a silver bullet mechanism right now for what electrification should look like. In the graph I showed, at the very beginning, we struggled to get in the study of carbon reduction potential. We struggled to get enough electrification to the stock to get the carbon reductions we wanted to without some sort of fuel switching credit. So in here you can see that the long strings of this area is the one that has FS at the end. FS0 with no credit, FS20 with 20% capital credit. So within our model, capital cost credit was what it took to get people to switch, because electricity is more expensive than natural gas within this model. Some cities in California are putting in electrification mandates. It'll be interesting to see how this play out. I don't know if Tianzin might have some comments on the one happening in Berkeley. But I'm not sure there's necessarily ready set this is the pathway to do electrification, because it's complicated, especially with natural gas companies involved, and also thinking about, equity issues in terms of fuel poverty in cold regions, that you're putting a burden on homeowners or renters that might already spend large portions of their income on natural gas, switching to electricity. There's a lot of potential things to kind of navigate in that space. So I don't know, Tianzhen, if you have any comments on some of the electrification mandates.
Yeah, I think it's fuel switching. I think it's a very controversial issue in California. I think some cities like Berkeley are more aggressive, and that requires any new building, right, to not use natural gas. And I think maybe San Francisco will follow. But I think statewide, I think there's a lot of debate, how soon and how the mandate could work.
Home appliances sold here in the United States are made in different countries, like Japan, South Korea, Mexico, China, United States, Europe. Was there a study in evaluating the real energy efficiency of those machines made in different countries?
So are you talking about life cycle efficiency impact, like life cycle energy impact, considering that manufacturing is quite remote?
The energy efficiency itself.
The use of the appliance.
The uses.
No, so not the life cycle then.
Not the life cycle.
So the efficiency difference based on where it was manufactured or based on location of use?
So your question is, how do appliances manufactured in different countries compare to one another in terms of their energy efficiency?
Exactly, yeah.
I'm actually not sure. I've seen a study in terms of comparison by country of origin.
Okay, just curious.
I think it also might be tricky because manufacturers produce different appliances for different markets. So, it might be a Japanese company selling to the U.S. that would have a different product than a Japanese company selling in Japan.
But I wonder if that, then putting it in a life cycle perspective, whether the energy efficiency of a product manufactured overseas is completely eclipsed by the energy associated with transporting it to the United States.
It probably depends on the appliance. I doubt it for some things like HVAC equipment, but traditionally the Department of Energy has not done very much work in embodied energy. They've been very focused on operational use in the building. I do think that DOE is starting to have an increased interest in looking at some of these life cycle impacts, and I'm really excited about it. And I'm hoping that there'll be a greater emphasis on that going forward.
Another question? Okay.
I've got an oil furnace and I found out a gas line. From a carbon point of view, does it make sense to put in a gas furnace? Right now, the cost is much less than the oil, but ignore the money value. Does it make that much difference to the environmental?
From an emissions perspective.
Emissions perspective, yeah. Ignoring the cost of oil versus gas.
So I don't know if you heard that, but forgetting about the cost of oil versus gas, but if you had an oil-based furnace in a house, does it make sense to replace it to gas right now from a climate perspective?
Probably in the near-term climate perspective, yes. The better option would probably be going electric because of the lifespan of that technology and the potential for the electric grid to decarbonize over the future.
Okay, we're pushing 6 o'clock. Any other last? We have probably time for maybe one or two more questions if there's any in the room or online. Corinne, anything else? No. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank both of our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us from far away. This was great. Thanks to the folks who attended, both in person and online. And please join us next month for discussions about flooding. And if any of you need continuing education credits, please see Corinne on the way out. And online, if you email us, we will send you your certificate. Okay, so see you all first Wednesday of the month. See you next, and have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you.